everybody. I'm Rosemary Barton, one of the hosts of The National, and welcome to our special event here online at CBC in Toronto, a national conversation about Canada-U.S. relations. Because, as you know, the midterms have wrapped up. It would appear there's a new deal on Nafta. We'll see whether it will hold. And we thought this would be a good time for everyone to check in on the state of affairs between our two countries. So first things first, let me tell you how you can ask questions, because a lot of tonight is dependent not only on the live audience outside, but also on the questions that you will have for all of us online. So if you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, you can put some of your questions down below, and we've got producers watching those questions. They'll feed them to me, and I'll get them to our panel, who I'll introduce you to in a moment. But also, as a special guest tonight, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, will join us in about 20 to 30 minutes' time. She'll give us her take on how that relationship has unfolded, because she's had to navigate a lot of it. And she'll take a couple of questions from you online too. So if you think you've got good questions for the minister, weigh in now, because those will be hot commodities, and we'll go quickly. So behind me, our panel, some familiar faces. Let's start with my co-host. She's my favorite. I should tell the rest of the panelists, Adrienne Arsenault, who has, of course, been doing midterm coverage as well, but was a Washington correspondent, has been everywhere in the world. So she's going to be talking to us about her take. And, of course, our other good friend, Keith Boag, senior correspondent in Washington. He's been with us all week, covering the midterms, and then two faces that are not as familiar, but we're thrilled to have them here as well. New friends, Washington Post correspondent Karen Demerjen and Aaron Blake, and they are all here to take some of your questions. First, we're going to have a little chat to sort of lay out where we think things are at, and then we'll have the minister come up. Aaron and I are going to double team her, because that's what it'll take, and then we'll take questions from all of you watching live online. So this is sold out. This is totally packed out here.
Intimidating.
Isn't it? Do you think that Americans would show up for a conversation about Canada-U.S. relations?
You want the honest answer?
I do, Aaron.
Diplomatic
No,
answer?
I want it
am
honest.
Am I being President Trump, or am I being Chrystia Freeland right now?
Yeah, you're just going to be Aaron.
I think that, it depends on how big the room is, maybe. If we had a 50 or 100 seats, probably a little bit. A room this size, I would not expect to see people lined up, but I'm so glad that people are.
Yeah, what do you think, Keith? People show up in Washington for a conversation? Well, would Americans show up? Canadians would show up.
To show up for that conversation?
Yeah.
I mean, there may be other reasons they showed up, but not for that conversation, so they may change the subject pretty quickly.
There's no open bar here, so the people online
No, if we were talking legalizing pot,
yes,
maybe
that could be a draw.
Yeah. What do you think? What kinds of questions are you expecting? Do you think people have I think people have a heightened interest after the week that we've had.
Yeah, the midterms are almost a distant memory now, 48 hours ago. So there's plenty to chat about.
Yeah. And so you cover Congress.
I do.
Yeah. And you cover
everything.
Everything that moves.
Whatever happens. So she knows a lot about that, and I know a little about everything else.
And you two know a lot about a lot.
Or not.
Yes,
or not.
you do.
For sure, I hope we get the questions about fake news. I hope we get it. I'm
going to give you that question whether you want it or not.
Score.
Yeah.
I hope we get questions about populism, polarization. I have a feeling all those things that are porous, that move across borders, we'll probably end up talking about. I mean, we do all the time anyway.
I spent my lunchtime in a round table where I was questioned for an hour and a half.
Oh, is that an interrogation? Are you in trouble?
It was very friendly, and I enjoyed it very much, but it was a reminder how much Canadians know about American politics.
Yeah.
Yes.
The questions were very good, very thoughtful, and it was hard really for me to gauge whether I was telling them anything they didn't already know. So.
One of the questions I had for my At Issue panel, which will still air tonight, even though I'm not hosting and Adrienne's not hosting, was, do we pay too much attention? Do we give too much time to American politics? My answer was no, because I just don't know how you could look away, and I think the whole world's doing it. Right?
Well, Paul Hunter, one of our other Washington correspondents, went down to the U.S. during the presidential election, and a pastor said to him, why are you here? And then the pastor said, you know what, I guess you'd want to know if your neighbor's house was burning down.
Okay, on that note, here we go.
So the midterms are over. The Democrats have regained control of the House.
There are some obvious questions.
What's next?
Where do things go from here?
What does it all mean?
For America, for Canada, for Donald Trump, for Justin Trudeau.
For climate change, for security.
For immigration, for the economy.
For the USMCA, which is just the new Nafta.
What can we learn?
About elections.
About voting.
About political divisions.
Canada is not the United States, but that doesn't mean there aren't lessons to be learned here.
What I learned from covering the midterm elections
What I learned covering the midterms is
What I learned covering the midterms
is that the United States isn't just divided in two, it's divided in many ways.
is that so many Americans are trying to find middle ground, but so many others are finding it really hard to resist the pull of polarization.
we can never expect anything in American politics to be like it was before.
The question I have is, will Canada stick by the United States, or will we see signs of splintering?
We'll look at what's on the line here for Canada and whether there are lessons for the coming federal election.
Tonight, an exclusive live stream conversation to sort it all out.
I'm Adrienne Arsenault. I'm one of the co-hosts of The National.
I'm Keith Boag, Washington correspondent for CBC News.
I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for The Washington Post.
I'm Karen Demerjen, and I'm a congressional reporter covering national security for The Washington Post.
And if we're talking foreign affairs, we'll have the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, join us for a live interview on stage, and she'll take some of your questions, because this is your conversation.
And away we go. Welcome. I'm Rosemary Barton, one of the co-hosts of The National, here with this illustrious panel to dig into what is really your conversation, a chance for us to talk about Canada-U.S. relations after what has been a crazy week and certainly a tumultuous year if you think about all the time that the federal government has spent negotiating that new deal on Nafta. So you know these faces very well, Adrienne and Keith here on my left. They will take lots of questions. And then here on my right, less familiar faces but new friends to us, Karen and Aaron. They're from the Washington Post, and they have a different perspective, and a perspective I think we're all going to appreciate tonight. If you are watching at home, live streaming it, you can of course put your questions underneath on Facebook or on YouTube, and we will get to that. If you are in our live audience, we have two producers, and when that portion of the evening gets going, just raise your hand and we'll try and get to everybody, because we do want to hear your questions and try and lead the conversation that way. If you want to watch yourself ask a question tomorrow, we'll broadcast some of this on The National, and about an hour-long chunk of it tomorrow at 8 p.m. on CBC News Network. So let's get things started, and we're going to start not with the state of relations. We're going to start with what's in the news. This happened yesterday, and I think it's important we start there because it was a dramatic event. It was a dramatic event for journalists, particularly those who cover the White House regularly. So let's show you the tape, and then we'll get everybody to weigh in. Here it is.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings
Let
would
me
be
ask,
much better.
if I may
Okay,
ask
that's
one other
enough.
question, Mr. President, if I may ask
Peter,
one
go
other
ahead.
question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's
Mr.
enough.
President,
That's
I was
enough.
going to ask one of the other folks. have
That's
had-
enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr.
Excuse
President,
me. That's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other
Peter,
question,
let's
if
go.
I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have
I'm not concerned
indictments-
about anything with
that you
the
may have
Russian
indictments coming down?
investigation because it's a hoax.
Are you-
That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN. Go ahead.
I think that's unfair.
You're a
I've
very
worked-
rude person. The way you treat Sarah Huckabee is horrible. And the way you treat other people are horrible. You shouldn't treat people that way. Go ahead. Go ahead, Peter, go ahead.
In Jim's defense, I've traveled with him and watched him. He's a diligent reporter who busts
Well,
his
I'm
butt
not a
like the
big
rest
fan
of
of
us.
yours either, so
I understand.
to be honest with you.
So let me ask you a question if I can. You repeatedly
You
said,
aren't the best.
Mr. President, you repeatedly, over the course
Okay,
of the...
just sit down, please. Well, when you report fake news, when you report fake news, which CNN does a lot, you are the enemy of the people. Go ahead.
Mr. President, over the course.
Okay, that kind of scenario has played out a number of times, although perhaps not to that extent over the past couple of years. What happened after that event was that Jim Acosta went back to the White House and found out that his press credentials had been revoked, much to his surprise. The White House said it was because he had put his hands on the White House intern who was trying to get the microphone. It was pretty clear that that is not what happened. But now Jim Acosta not really allowed to do his job anymore. So we thought that'd be a good place to start because it certainly colors the relationship between our two countries and how everybody here does their job. So Aaron, let's start with you. I mean, you must have been surprised when that happened, or maybe not. I don't know.
I would lean towards the latter. What we just saw in the video there and what actually happened as that press conference went on was an extension of what we've been seeing for the better part of the last 3 years. It's been the rhetoric at his rallies where he's been calling the media fake news. It's been occasional clashes in the briefing room with reporters. There was one point at which CNN was declined from attending an event in the Rose Garden in the White House. They have scaled back the number of daily briefings to almost nothing. So the White House is taking kind of these punitive measures as we move along in order to try and get more favorable coverage or to punish coverage that they don't necessarily appreciate. And I think what we saw on Tuesday was a combination of the growing frustration and the fact that the president wants to use the media as his foil, and also perhaps some frustration at how the election had gone the night before, where the president suffered the largest defeat for a Republican House since 1974. It was not a good night for him, and I think there was frustration showing there.
Yeah, he wasn't in a good mood. I think that's fair to say. So Karen, this also affects your job as you try and cover Congress. Explain to people, why that depicting, journalists as the enemy or as fake, how that affects your job concretely.
Well, I mean, you see the mantra of fake news repeated, not just by the president's fans at his rallies, but you see it repeated by his allies across the elected spectrum as well. I have had members of Congress say, oh, Washington Post, that's fake news. It's a crutch for saying, I know you're going to challenge me. I know that you're not going to be necessarily sympathetic to my position. But I mean, I had one congressman use that as a thing that he would say and then refuse to talk to me when I tried to ask him a question in the hallway, which is basically how we worked, going straight up to the members of the House and the Senate and asking them exactly what they think or what they know about certain issues. So probably that congressman wouldn't have wanted to talk to me regardless of whether he'd said fake news or not, as the label I was going to have to bear. But the fact is that that label now is tossed about in this way, and it's almost easy. It makes it easy to have that as a crutch now to say that, frankly, it's the mainstream media that with the decades, centuries-long reputation of being pretty even-handed that are getting that moniker.
I always say fake news is not an argument, it's a slogan. If somebody says fake news to you, they are not disputing anything that you have reported. They are just throwing a blanket over you and saying, I don't even want to talk about it, I don't want to defend myself.
But it is remarkable how much it has filtered down to real Americans. You were just there. I was in Ohio a couple weeks back and at a deli, and people said to me, hey, in Canada, do people believe what you say? And I said, I think so, because I think you do. But I'm sure you guys hear it all the time. Did you hear it when you were down there?
A little bit. I mean, I watched what happened there with Jim Acosta as sort of as a warning for us, here. And a couple things sort of come to mind. I mean, I can't firstly imagine the intestinal fortitude of being a White House correspondent right now. He must have like a stack of Rolaids somewhere. But I also think there's a trap, and that's taking the bait, of sort of becoming so frustrated that you stand up again and you start arguing with the president. And I can understand on a human level how that happens, but I see it as a warning sign to the rest of us, that this is a time when we're being challenged as journalists, that it's ever more important to just do your job and be calm and ask the reasonable questions and try to stay above reproach, because people are looking for you to take the bait. And to a degree, it's what happened with Hillary Clinton, too, as a politician when she launched into the basket of deplorables. That was just an off-the-cuff comment at a fundraiser, and to a degree, it sunk her. And it was certainly used. And I think don't take the bait has to be something we have to remind ourselves of often.
Because the practical impact of that, Keith, on the rest, people watching the news is what? When they see the president and a CNN reporter clashing in that way, what is the practical impact
It undermines us. I think your boss Marty Barron has it right. We're not at war, we're at work. And that kind of scene makes it look as though we are at war. And we can't afford that because we won't win that. It services the argument that the president is making to his most loyal supporters that we are their enemy too. I think it's important to understand what the president's doing here very clearly, though. He's not trying to push back against just a news story or the negativity of what he perceives to be their coverage. It is really an attempt to undermine the public's trust in all media, to persuade them that there is another reality that can be defined by the president alone. And that is such a dangerous thing because a free press is a cornerstone of a free democracy. And so his attacks on the press in that context are an attack on democracy. It's a difficult thing for us to cover. We are used to covering things that fall within what can be defined, I think, as legitimate controversy. And I think we're good at that even though we make mistakes. We know how to do that. But too many things with this president have fallen outside legitimate controversy into an area of deviance. And we're still learning how to cover that.
Okay, I want to move on to the results of Tuesday night that we all covered from various positions and get into how they change things in Washington and how they might change things for us too, because they inevitably will. After we've spent 2 years trying to figure out how to deal with Donald Trump, what is the new reality here? Karin, let's start with you. Did it surprise you? You cover Congress. Is this sort of what you had expected the evening to be?
Yeah, I think everybody expected, you could have made this guess a year ago, that the House was inclined to go Democratic. The Senate, the races that were up this year, it looked like the Republicans should hold on to the Senate unless something went very wrong, and the governors were kind of a mix out there too. I think that's reflective of what's going on in the mapping of the country, which is that you're seeing suburban areas get frustrated with the president, and that can be expressed in the change of your representative when you're talking about a smaller, an office like a House representative that is not statewide. And yet in the states, some of the close polling, it didn't cut the way of the Democrats in Texas or in Indiana or in Florida or places that you thought it might. So that wasn't so much a surprise. It's also not going to be a surprise that you're going to have nothing but acrimony in D.C. for the next 2 years going forward. I mean, the president, as angry as he was the next day in that press briefing, had to be breathing a sigh of relief he didn't lose the Senate, because it means that he can push ahead with this Republican plan to get as many conservative judges on the courts as possible, which is the long-term game that could really change the general culture in the country, frankly, over the next generation. But Democrats are going to start investigating him on day one. They're probably not going to try to impeach him because that would risk too much, but that's just going to create fights between Congress and the White House, between the two houses, between Democrats and Republicans. And if the last 2 years you thought were, divided and acrimonious in the United States, just buckle in, because it's going to be worse coming up.
Well, that's hard to
Super.
imagine,
Excellent.
right?
Yeah.
Super uplifting.
Yeah, well, sorry. I didn't come here to deliver good news.
And the practical impact, again, on Canada, and we'll ask the minister, you and I will ask her about it, would be what? That, we thought, okay, NAFTA's done and dusted, we can move on, and now...
Now we have a Democratic House that is going to take over before this is going to get a vote. The Democrats need to figure out how they want to play this thing. Looming over all of this is the fact that we not just ended a campaign. We are starting a campaign within a matter of weeks here. We have had a number of high-profile candidates say they are going to announce their intentions by the end of the year for the 2020 presidential race. And Democrats need to decide whether they want to sign off on this, something that could be construed as a major victory for President Trump, something that President Trump will come forward and say is a major victory because that's his style. Anytime there's any kind of a change that he spearheads, he's going to have a big ceremony and he's going to have go out in the Rose Garden and talk about the deal that he cut to get Nafta gone, and this deal is so much better. Democrats need to figure out how they're going to play this. And over the course of the last 10, 15 years in Washington politics, the safest political strategy for both parties has been to just stand in the way, not let anything happen, and reap the benefits in the next election. And I think there's a compelling case that Democrats are going to want to do that. Now, whether they stand their ground on trade, that's a big question.
I think they also have to make a decision about who they are. I mean, it's not clear coming out of the midterms, what is a Democrat? Is a Democrat someone who leans to the, describes himself as progressive left, or a compromise candidate? And I think people were looking for some indication after the midterms of what it would be. And certainly as Canadians, we were looking for, what sort of candidate will Canada maybe have to deal with? It's not clear. And I know, I was in Tennessee, which was interesting because the candidate for the Democratic Party there was someone who said, if I need to side with the president, I will if it's good for Tennessee. If he doesn't do something good for Tennessee, I won't. I'm the ultimate compromise candidate. I'm the future of the Democratic Party. Well, he was walloped by a woman who is very ideologically based and is more Trumpian than Trump himself sometimes. So I think it's a signal to us that, as you said, get ready, it's going to become even more polarized.
That seems hard for us to understand, even as we watch it here. I think, Keith, that it is that entrenched on both sides. We talk about, and you have used the word tribalism before, the way it has become. And what fed into that during the midterms? What kinds of things did the president do to ratchet that up? What kinds of policy areas did he use in particular?
Well, I think a way of looking at that question is look at the strategic choices he made during the campaign. There are reasons not to try to run on a good economy. It's hard. But many people thought that he would. Whether you think the underlying fundamentals of the economy are strong or not, he had good data, low unemployment, real growth, high stock market, chose not to run on that. Chose to run on the same themes that he ran in 2016. And that was a divisive campaign then. I think this was a more divisive campaign. I went to his rallies. I saw the things that he said. It's 2018 now. Somebody tell Donald Trump that Hillary Clinton is not involved in politics as an active player anymore, but he was campaigning against her and standing back and enjoying watching the crowd join in another chant of lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. So was your question about divisiveness? It is only going to get worse. In a way, I think it has to get worse before it gets better.
I want to talk a little bit about the new Nafta, or as we like to call it, USMACA. That's what we've decided we're calling it in Canada. I don't know if you guys have caught on.
It's like the U.S. Marine Corps, but with an A on the end.
Oh, okay, all right.
Or like the YMCA song, right?
Yeah, it's like that too. We'll get it sorted by the end of the night, because the minister is going to join us shortly, and she, of course, was central to those negotiations. So, Karin, let's start with you. Do you think that there was talk that it would be signed off by the end of November? That's not going to happen now.
Seems unlikely. I mean, look, Congress isn't going to take any hard moves that are that visible before they actually get something formally delivered to them, which hasn't happened yet. This has always been an issue that is cut more on geography than it has on politics, so it's hard to guess.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that, parts of the country are agricultural. Parts of the country have a historical tie to the manufacturing industries. The manufacturing parts of the country do not like aluminum and steel tariffs because they're concerned with end goods, and to have to pay more for your raw goods to produce whatever you're going to do, that's a problem. That does not cut the same way as, the argument of, well, anything coming in cheaply is bad for the United States. And that's why you saw so many Republicans in the last year say, we don't really like this, but they also swallowed it because they wanted to learn to win the midterms and not muck up that messaging that the president had to really carry. You start to criticize the president too much, he can't be your fighter in chief, you potentially lose more than the House. So at this point, if Democrats choose to reopen the question of do they agree with everything, just kind of generally reopen that trade discussion, they probably won't do it across the board. They'll probably pick and choose their areas. And the real push come to shove is going to be, do Republicans from certain areas take that opening to kind of hop in also and say, we were actually never okay with this part of it.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit more before we ink this? You're probably going to see that happening in not cut and dry, kind of mucky ways in the next few months, because as soon as they actually get that deal and have to vote on it, they don't want to be the ones that get blamed for there not being any trade deal in North America.
Which, would be bad news for Canada, who thought, well, this took us 13 months, we've got it now, we can move on, and maybe that won't be the case. Keith, how much does trade and these steel and aluminum tariffs that are still looming over Canada, the government didn't manage to get rid of those, how much does that factor into the way Donald Trump positions himself or what he sells to people? Is that a big thing that people are listening to?
It's an interesting thing. I agree with everything that Karen just said. I think that's the way it is. I think there can be you can make a mistake of thinking that because the Democrats have the majority in the House, that it's going to be hard for Donald Trump to find votes. It probably isn't going to be that hard. He's going to start off with close to a couple hundred votes that are Republican votes. So he needs, depending on whether exactly what that number is, he needs about 20 or maybe 24 Democrats to vote with Republicans. There are Democrats who campaigned literally on working with Donald Trump, okay? That is not to say that they were Donald Trump supporters.
On trade, you're talking about.
On a range of issues, and trade would be among them, right? But on a range of issues, there were Democrats who were campaigning in traditionally, or states that Donald Trump won in 2016, who knew that in order to persuade voters to support them, they couldn't just go to Washington to oppose Donald Trump. They had to be explicitly saying that they would work with him when it was in the interests of their constituents.
Interesting.
And so those Democrats that Karun was talking about, who have real self-interest in their constituencies, in the trade agreement, those are votes that are likely available to Donald Trump to pass. You smacker, you call it.
Do you agree that could actually pose some problems for that deal and other things?
And the other interesting thing here, I think, is going to be if Congress does start dragging its feet on this, and Democrats try to get these concessions, maybe even if Republicans join in and say, oh, if we're going to renegotiate this thing in public, here's what we want. The president, I would not put it past him to just say, okay, guess what? I'm going to just get rid of Nafta right now. And you guys can either approve this thing or not, and we'll see what happens. We'll see where the cards fall. He has conducted his entire foreign policy, his entire diplomatic presidency in that manner of basically, trying to get leverage over somebody. We call it the madman theory. Make people think that he is capable of doing anything, that they can't trust him, that they need to basically plan for any eventuality that he might put forward. And so I think if there's one issue he's willing to do that on, it's trade.
Really?
And he's not going to let this, what he views as a signature item like this, just pass by without some kind of a fight like that.
And there's more than enough experience in and around Washington and in Congress that they know that you start cherry picking apart these kinds of agreements and it never ends. The deal has been made. Typically, these are going to be up and down votes. I don't know if that is specifically true with this one because I didn't pay close attention to the fast track provisions, but in the past, that's the way that it's been. You don't get to cherry pick. You get to say yes or you get to say no.
And if the danger is that Trump says, you're poking too much, I'm going to rip this whole thing up, that's actually a reason that they might not touch it.
Right.
Because the balancing act that Democrats have to do is get as close to the president as you can, challenging him without making your own people who won in Trump countries, the Democrats who won in Trump districts, have to take the blame for anything.
Right.
Because if people are going to be voting for Trump in 2020, you want them to be able to vote a split ticket. I mean, ideally, I'm sure Democrats don't want them to vote for Trump at all, but this is the reality, and that goes to Adrienne's point before of it's going to be really hard for the Democrats to find their identity, because do they play to the middle or do they play to the base? And we saw it succeed in both places and we saw it fail in both places this time around.
And it's also a misnomer that Democrats would be more open to free trade than Republicans. That is also not the case.
Go back to the TPP.
Yes.
At that time, Barack Obama was the president of the United States, and he negotiated fast-track authority through the Republican caucus, not the Democratic caucus.
And that is something Canada went on to sign and the United States abandoned. Okay, I think we're going to take a social question from someone from, none of my real bodies here, you'll get your turn as well, but someone from Facebook or YouTube. So if you have a question now, fire away. And then we'll get Minister Freeland up on stage and ask her a few questions. And again, you'll have a chance. We'll take a couple of questions from the audience live and in person and a couple from you on stream. John Bourassa on Facebook asks, why do we force ourselves into a country that abuses our relationship at every turn, from having such a low price for our oil to softwood lumber? John, why don't you tackle that one, Adrienne?
Sorry, why do we force ourselves?
Well, I think he just wants to know why do we continue to be part of a relationship that John, at least, thanks John, thinks is abusive, because the United States takes advantage of us when it comes to softwood a price of oil which is largely depreciated in the U.S.
Well, I mean, you can't choose your family. I mean, I'm sorry, Mom. I know you're sorry.
She's really there.
Yeah, she really is. Look, we have no choice. We were just talking backstage that when Paul Hunter, your fellow in Washington, another Washington correspondent, went down to the U.S. in the 2016 election, and a pastor said to him, "Why are you here?" And then the pastor stopped and answered his own question and said, "Oh, I guess you'd want to know if your neighbor's house is burning down, right? Like you'd stick your head out the window and smell for smoke." So there's an element of that going on. You know, we have no choice.
No,
And for good and for bad. And you know, what happens there affects us. And, you know, again, 2016, I was covering the election. I was outside the White House. As soon as it was clear Donald Trump had won, we went outside the gates, past the point where Jim Acosta cannot get in anymore, sadly. And there were a whole bunch of Trump supporters and a whole bunch of very upset people. And a Trump supporter in the MAGA hat, completely hammered, came up to me and said, "You Canadians are so smug." And I said, oh, okay. And he said, "And you're only smug because you have us. No one is coming up through your borders. No one is going to attack you because you have us. Just you wait until things change, and we'll see how your attitudes change." And I've often thought, you know, you were A, drunk, but B, smart. You know, and it is interesting how we've seen the conversation change here as circumstances in this country.
And I mean, there's factual reasons, John, why it matters, right? It's our biggest trading partner. I think it's 400,000 people across the border every day. People have investments in the U.S. There's all those things. But we asked this question backstage when we were joking around a little bit. Do Americans care about the relationship, Aaron? Before we get the minister on stage, and she can tell us her thoughts on that too, but. Do Americans care about us as much as we care about you?
I think the president actually projects the way a lot of Americans feel about this relationship. Maybe not in the exact words that he uses, but he views even longtime allies, even neighbors, as business partners, as competitors, and as adversaries when it comes to jobs, when it comes to trade deficits. It's all part of making deals. There was an interview just a few weeks ago in which the president was on 60 Minutes, and he was asked about imposing tariffs on Canada, on Japan, on South Korea, and he said, and Leslie Stahl said, "Why are you doing this to our allies?" And the president says, "What's an ally?" He's questioning the very notion of an ally, and I think the treatment of countries like Canada is very much an outgrowth of that. He is challenging the very notion that a country like Canada needs to be treated any differently than a country like Russia does.
There you go. Because these tariffs on steel and aluminum, and we'll get into this with the minister, they are, just to remind you, he's imposed them under national security threat, which, when Canadians hear that, think is pretty bananas. I don't know if Americans feel the same way.
It depends on who you're talking to. I mean, I think there's been a trend in the last few years towards, and it frankly began before Trump came to office, when Republicans were very deficit-minded and focused, which they don't really talk about anymore because now they're or they were in total power the last 2 years. But the idea of talking about the country's financial situation, the fact that we do have such a mounting debt problem, of that being a national security threat, and our economic stability and not kind of being leveraged to China and various other places was a lasting problem. So I think that this kind of comes as an outgrowth of that is still socially acceptable to talk about in an era in which we're kind of ignoring the fact that we're cutting massive checks and you know, working on credit for the most part. So, I mean, frankly, we'll see how that changes going forward, because again, you're going to start having a more splintered discussion about all kinds of money, all kinds of tax, all kinds of trade issues, and if those sorts of terms are still used.
Okay, we're going to let at least 3 people leave, if you don't mind. You can come back.
No.
And when they come back, we want to take all of your questions. So that gives you a sense of what they have to say, but I'm sure you've got better questions than I do. So stand by. And we're going to bring Minister Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, onto the stage, and we'll talk to her and take some of your questions too. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland. Hello.
Hi, Rosemary.
Nice to see you.
It's really good to see you.
This is Erin.
Very nice to meet you. Welcome.
I'm not sure. I think we're putting you here.
That's
Have
what I
a
was
seat.
told.
Okay, very good.
Hi, everyone.
How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are
Good.
you?
I'm good, yeah. The last time we talked, you had been awake for 13 months, I think, basically.
Yes, and so had you.
Yes. Well, you worked harder than I did, to be fair.
I don't know, the journalist covering the talks worked really hard.
Well, Katie Simpson did. I don't know that I worked as hard as her. So Erin and I are going to sort of double team you a little bit, if that's okay, from our different perspectives. Let's just start with Tuesday night and the results of the midterms. When you saw those results, did you say to yourself, oh, shoot, now I got to get to know a whole new slew of people, or I've got to change my approach to the United States? How did you react to those?
You know, Rosie, when I saw those results, I said what I think every Canadian government always says after every US election, which is a core job of any federal government of Canada, a core job of any Canadian foreign minister, is to have a working relationship with whoever the Americans elect. And that was our job before Tuesday, and that is our job after Tuesday, and that will be our job after the 2020 elections. So, and you know, we Canadians are pretty good at working with the Americans. It's been a core job of Canadian federal governments for as long as we've been a country. And we're good at working with all different types and flavors of Americans, and that's what we're going to keep on doing.
We've never had a flavor like Donald Trump, though, I'm pretty sure, Erin. So I'll let you go next.
I wanted to turn to the USMCA because obviously that's the biggest issue between the two countries right now. There have been some comments in recent days, both by the Prime Minister and the Ambassador, about where this stands as far as tariffs go. There is some surprise that those tariffs have not been lifted yet. I know that we've talked about or you guys have talked about how these are two-track negotiations. One side is the tariff, one side is replacing Nafta. Has there been any kind of assurance that the Canadian government has received about lifting those tariffs as a part of this trade discussion?
So to go back to the beginning of your question, Erin, there was some surprise in Canada and I think around the world when the tariffs were imposed. You know, we tend to see this as a Canada-US issue, but this is really a US and the world issue. Section 232 has been on the books since the early 60s, but this is an unprecedented use of that section, which is really meant to be used in very specific national security situations where the security of the country is threatened.
What would be a real example of when you could use it? What would be an actual example?
Well, in time of war, I think it would be quite reasonable to impose tariffs against the countries that you were fighting, for example. So this is really unprecedented. And as you were saying, Rosie, earlier, I heard the last part of the previous chat. I think for Canadians, there is an added level of absurdity. Not only are we the NATO allies of the United States, we are NORAD allies. We share the longest unmilitarized border in the world with the United States. Furthermore, our trade in steel with the United States is perfectly balanced. In fact, the United States has a slight surplus. So really, there is no reasonable argument to have imposed these tariffs on Canada. That's what we said at the beginning. It is actually absurd. And that's why when the tariffs were imposed, we said that we would impose retaliatory measures. And we did. Our retaliation is balanced. It is perfectly reciprocal, dollar for dollar retaliation. It went into force on July 1st. And our tariffs will remain in place until the US tariffs are lifted. Now, I think it would make fabulous sense for both Canada and the United States for those tariffs to be lifted. We are hearing from US businesses, we are hearing from US legislators, even the United Steelworkers in the US, who are supportive of 232 tariffs overall, have publicly, repeatedly called for the tariffs on Canada to be lifted. So Canada's position is, lift these tariffs now. They're hurting everybody.
I understand that's the position, but why not say we are not going to sign on to USMCA until these tariffs are lifted? Why not use the leverage that you have as a part of these trade negotiations to actually get an assurance rather than having this hanging out there for a number of months?
You know, we have said, as you mentioned at the beginning, from the moment that the tariffs were first contemplated, we've been very clear that they are on an entirely separate track from NAFTA. And that is not just a matter of opinion, that's a matter of law. The tariffs, and it's been very important for us to make that distinction clear, because there were some efforts to say, And frankly, to justify the tariffs, the 232 tariffs, to say, well, these are necessary in order to get the Canadians to do such and such at the negotiating table. And it was very important for us not to let those waters be muddied, to say the use of this Section 232 national security tariff is entirely separate from our NAFTA negotiation. And by the way, we do a lot of trade with the United States. We trade $2 billion every day. We do have trade irritants in other areas. Softwood lumber is one ongoing issue. And it's very important to keep these tracks separate with 232, in addition to imposing our retaliation, which is having an impact. We have also taken WTO and NAFTA cases, and we're going to pursue those.
Well, and do you feel, though, when we eventually get to the signing part of USMACA, which eventually we will, one would expect probably in the new year now, you're comfortable signing that deal even if the tariffs are in place? It sounded like from Ambassador McNaughton last night on CBC as though you might show up but like sign in a closet somewhere and just not throw a party about it.
Look, my position from day one, as Aaron mentioned, has been very consistent, and it is unchanged. That the tariffs and the NAFTA negotiation and our other trade irritants, each one has to go in its separate track. And that's the position that Canada takes. Now, obviously, when it comes to the tariffs, I want to be really clear. I think they are really a dumb thing to have in place. They are illegal, they're unjustified, they're absurd, and they are hurting both countries. And we think the best thing to do for Canada and the United States would be just to lift those mutual tariffs. And I do feel that voices in the United States are being raised. People are saying this because the tariffs are having an effect and our retaliation is having an effect. And I do also feel, Aaron and Rosie, that there is goodwill in the trade relationship following the signing of the agreement in principle. And I do think it would make a lot of sense for that goodwill to translate into a lifting of the
It doesn't
tariffs.
sound to me, though, like you think that you could even use it as leverage. If you want to keep it on two tracks, and I understand everything you're saying, it doesn't sound to me like you think you have any leverage anyway.
Well, there's always leverage. And Canada, we've always been very clear, actually, that we think we have a lot of leverage in our relationship with the United States, because while, as you said a minute ago, Rosie, quite rightly, that the U.S. is our largest trading partner, we are their largest market. A lot of Americans aren't really aware of that, but Canada is the largest market for the United States, larger than China, Japan, and the UK combined. So we do have leverage in the relationship, but we think it's important to use that leverage in the right places. We believe in rules, we believe in laws, we believe in procedures, and we think it's important to keep everything in its own lane.
Before we get to the questions of the audience, I think we have a couple more.
Sure. The Prime Minister Trudeau, a few days ago in an interview with CNN, he was asked about his father's comment that you should always trust people. And question was asked in relation to President Trump. And Prime Minister Trudeau's response was, "What my father taught me was to trust Canadians."
I'm going to clap
Aaron.
too. I can't top that. I do trust Canadians.
I
by the
don't
way.
disagree with that philosophy, but people like me look at that quote and say, "Hey, you were drawing a line there between President Trump and Canadians. How are we not to take that as a suggestion that he does not trust President Trump?"
Well, that really is a question for the Prime Minister who made that comment. But I would say that
trust
the
him,
Prime
though?
Minister, trusting Canadians is something that the Prime Minister says a lot in our cabinet meetings. And he says it especially when we're talking about really complicated, difficult issues. And there can get to a point when someone will say, oh, this is the right thing to do, but it's going to be so hard to explain. And the Prime Minister in those moments will always say, you know what? Canadians are really smart. Let's just trust Canadians. So that is definitely not just something he said in the CNN interview. That is a rule our government lives by.
Is there evidence, though, that Canadians can trust Donald Trump?
I think that is really a question for the president and it is a question.
No.
for
That's a
Americans.
question for you too. Given the way he,
No,
given the way,
I'm not. I think it's a question for Americans. Americans are the ones who elect him, not us.
Given the
Our
way he
job-
has
our job,
behaved,
Rosie-
given the way he has behaved, though, you have to take him at his word when he says, "Yeah, we're going to go ahead and sign this." There's no evidence that this is a person that keeps his promises. I don't think. Am I wrong?
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah. So, so then, why should Canadians feel confident that you guys are okay trusting him?
Well,
Or do you not?
I was going to say, you've put a bunch of different words in my mouth, none of which I will sign up to. And let me say this, in terms of maybe the way to frame it is how we negotiate with the Americans and how you work with this counterparty. And the first thing I'll say is my counterparty is not the President of the United States.
Mr. Lighthizer.
It is our Prime Minister, whose counterparty is the President of the United States. And I am a little bit biased, but I think our Prime Minister has done an outstanding job in managing what is obviously a complex relationship. My counterparts are Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Ross, and Secretary Pompeo. And in the Nafta negotiation, my counterpart was and is Ambassador Lighthizer. And he is for sure a tough negotiator. I hope that I am too, and I hope he would say the same thing about me. But we have had throughout a very professional relationship. I would even call it cordial. And a few weeks ago, he came to Toronto to my house for a roast beef dinner.
So you trust Mr. Lighthizer?
I do trust Mr. Lighthizer.
Okay. One more for you?
Sure.
Okay. Then we'll take a couple from the audience, not too many.
Speaking of things that our respective leaders have said, I mentioned this a little bit a few minutes ago during our panel discussion. President Trump was on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago. He was asked about why he's, putting these tariffs on our allies, Canada, Japan. And Leslie Stahl said, "Why are you doing this to our allies?" And he responded and he said, "What's an ally?" He's basically, at least according to my reading, questioning the very premise of an ally. He is suggesting that maybe these are trading partners, these are just countries you do business with. Do you feel like Canada is still an American ally?
It's not a question of how I feel. It's a question of the reality, the economic reality, and also the military reality. We are very much an ally of the United States, and the United States is very much our ally. We are partners in NATO. We have shared obligations to one another under Article 5. And equally importantly, we are partners in NORAD. NORAD is the only joint command that the United States participates in the world. It's a joint command of Canadians and Americans. And that close relationship is essential because of geography, because of this vast, unmilitarized, and really used by human beings border. I was in BC in August with my colleague Carla Quattrone, and in her riding in Delta, kids cross the border to play on soccer teams, like not just to play soccer games, but there are soccer teams that have kids from both sides of the border. So yeah, of course we're allies. And that, again, it's not a matter of my feelings or frankly anybody's feelings. We are allies bound together by incredibly serious military commitments on both sides.
Okay, we're going to take a couple questions from the audience, from our live human beings, and a couple questions from social. I'm going to start with social if I can. Amy Barkat, because there's lots of people watching you on Facebook and YouTube right now, says the following.
What's her name?
Amy.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you agree with the claim that says what happens in the U.S. will eventually come to Canada? That because America is moving to right-wing populism, Canada eventually will follow? Why and why not? Good question, Amy.
It is a good question, Amy, and although it's an excellent question, I 1,000,000% disagree with it.
Tell us why.
Canada, we are Canadians. We are our own sovereign people who have for more than 150 years written our own destiny, and we are very much doing that today, as we have in the past. We share a lot with the United States. But as much as Canada is shaped by its close relationship with the United States, I think Canada is also shaped by the moments when we have very clearly chosen a different path. When the US had slavery, Canada did not. When the US chose to go to war in Vietnam, Canada did not. When the US chose to go to war in Iraq, Canada did not. And we're shaped by a lot more than those differences, but those differences are part of what shapes us. And I think that we as Canadians, I'm speaking for myself, but I hope I'm also speaking for my constituents and for a lot of Canadians. I think we're really proud of our own political choices. And, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau talked about the mouse and the elephant. My Prime Minister talks about the moose and the elephant. So we're always conscious of and influenced by that relationship. How could we not be? But I think that we are a pretty amazing country. And we are a country that makes its own choices and is proud to do that. And by the way, Rosie, being here in the CBC, this is one of the institutions that shapes our unique, distinct national identity. And one of the things that was really important for me in the Nafta negotiation was to maintain the cultural exception, precisely because the Canadian identity, political, economic, social, and absolutely cultural, is incredibly distinct, and it's going to stay that way.
Okay, let's go to the audience. Nicole Brewster is with someone who has a question. I think it's NAFTA related. Just give us your name and ask your question of the minister.
For sure.
And if you live in my riding, tell me.
I used to, so that's something. My name is Liam. My question is, first of all, congratulations on getting through the negotiations. And what was the single biggest concession Canada had to make in those negotiations?
What was the single biggest concession and?
Just that Canada had to make through those negotiations.
Let's see if you can make some news here, Liam.
Yeah. Look, any negotiation obviously involves compromise. That's why it's a negotiation. Otherwise, we would just have our list of what we want and get it. But unfortunately, when you sit down at the negotiating table, everyone has their list, and the lists do not fully overlap. I think probably the issue which Canadians are very aware was a difficult one, and where the U.S. wanted increased access, was access to the Canadian dairy market. I think that, I feel comfortable with the deal that we struck. The level of increased access is comparable to what was agreed to by the Conservative government in the TPP negotiations, about 3.59%. But that was something, that was a compromise that we offered to the United States as part of a broader deal.
It was a concession. Minister.
It was a compromise.
That's journalism, Liam, right there. Okay, Kareem Kassam on Facebook asks, with the changes in Congress in the United States, how likely is it that this new agreement will be changed before signing? I'm sure you heard us before talking about the fact that some people now may say, ooh, I wasn't actually comfortable with that. Could we maybe finesse things? Is that a legitimate concern for you, that there may be more tweaks before you get it signed?
So,
That's Kareem asking that. Not just me.
Well, Rosie and Kareem, my responsibility is Canada and the Canadian political process. And that's a wonderful responsibility to have, and it's a big responsibility. Ambassador Lighthizer responsibility is the United States and the US political process. And Mexico will be responsible for its own political process. And it would be presumptuous for us to, comment on and assume responsibility for somebody else's politics. So we don't.
You're not worrying about it then?
It's not our job to. Our job is to negotiate with the US officials who are entrusted by the US political system to be our counterparties. And we did that. We got a good deal for Canada. In negotiating our deal, it was our job to think really hard about getting a deal that would be acceptable to Canadians, and not just to one group of Canadians, but to a really wide group of Canadians that would be acceptable to the provinces, to the territories, to workers, to different industries which are diverse. And actually, you know, it was maybe more apparent to Canadians the work we did negotiating directly to Americans, but negotiating directly with Americans, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. I would say 90% of the work was working with the home team and figuring out what was the outline, the shape of a deal that would be a good deal for Canadians. And that's actually like Canadian professional trade negotiators, by the way, as a footnote, are totally brilliant geniuses. We have the best professional trade negotiators in the world. I love all those people. And their first rule of trade negotiations is the most important thing is to have a united home team, which we had, and that was Canada's biggest advantage in the negotiation. Why this is relevant to Kareem's question, Rosie, is my job was to figure out what Canada needed and to negotiate a deal that accomplished that. Ambassador Lighthizer job was to figure out what the United States needed, and you know,
Good luck to him.
he's responsible for that.
See how he does. Okay, we got one more question in the audience, Minister. Your name and your question, sir.
It's Jim. Minister,
Hi, Jim.
that with the risks that President was broadcasting on the news, what did Canada gain from the Nafta 2.0?
That is a great question, and thank you for answering it, because it's the flip side of Liam's question. I think we gained a lot. From my perspective, the single most important thing we gained was continued access to the US market, which is the largest market in the world and is the market for 70% of our exports. To have that is a really big deal. There were also a number of significant improvements compared to the old NAFTA, and I'll name a couple of them. My personal favorite is that we have gotten rid of ISDS between Canada and the United States. This is investor-state dispute settlement. It's a provision that allows US companies to sue the government of Canada if they feel that Canadian laws are hurting them. And it is particularly used to object to environmental and sometimes labor legislation. It has cost our government hundreds of millions of dollars, and it is not going to exist in the new NAFTA. I think that's a really good thing. Another thing that we got rid of, which I am really pleased about, is something that was known as the Energy Ratchet Clause, which committed us to selling a certain proportion of our energy exports to the United States. To me, that impinges on our sovereignty, and I'm glad that that's gone too. And then there are a number of smaller gains that you probably wouldn't know about unless they touch your particular sector, but that make a big difference. So today I was in Hamilton, and I was at a canola and soya processing plant making oil out of canola and soybeans, a particular interest of mine because my dad is a canola farmer. And no, it's true.
I know.
So I always love to go to like the canola guys. And one of the things that they were very excited about is we got a little more access to sell margarine to the United States. And it's making a difference for our canola farmers and for for margarine producers in Canada. We have increased access for sugar and sugar-containing products. That makes a difference for people who grow sugar beets. So there are some things in there like that that are also an improvement.
Okay, one last one, and then we're going to let you go. Yesterday, we saw a member of the White House press corps have his credentials revoked. You used to be a journalist. Do you think that's fair game?
I've been thinking about journalists in the world a lot, Rosie. And I really feel strongly, and the Prime Minister has been talking about this too, that it is important for political leaders particularly of democracies, to speak out for journalists for your right and your right to do your job, to ask questions which most of the time, to tell you the truth, Rosie. I like you as a person, but like most of the time, the questions are not so fun. But it's true. I'm always very nervous before being interviewed by Rosie because she's good. But I have really been, and I think a lot of us have been thinking a lot about what makes democracies democracies. And maybe, a simplistic way of thinking about it is it's just that people vote, right? A democracy is where you democratically elect your leaders. But I think a lot of people have been realizing that a democracy is much more than that. It's about a set of institutions and a set of behaviors that hold those elected leaders to account and hold them in check. The judiciary is another element that is essential. And so, a free press, the fifth estate, is absolutely essential to a healthy and functioning democracy. And what I can promise you, Rosie, speaking for myself and really speaking for our government, is, it was one of the Prime Minister's commitments during the campaign, and I think it is something we've lived up to, the Prime Minister gives a lot of interviews. I feel I give a lot of interviews. Our colleagues give a lot of interviews. We hold a lot of press conferences. We answer questions from journalists who ask us hard questions, and I think that is an essential part of democracy. So bravo to journalist Timothy Snyder in his new book. I think it's either The Road or The Path to Unfreedom. He dedicates it to the journalists, and he calls them the heroes of our time. And I really believe that. So bravo, guys.
That's what our foreign affairs minister sounds like. I'll point out that I'll just end on this. I don't have an interview with the Prime Minister yet, so we'll wait. Once that happens, I'll be much happier. Listen, thank you. You're extremely busy, and you've been very generous with your time, not just for us, but for Canadians. And I think that was really, really kind of you, and we do appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, Rosie.
Thank you.
It was really
thank
nice
you,
to be
Minister
here.
of Foreign Affairs.
Can I just ask one thing? Could everyone who lives in University Rosedale raise their hand?
That's not so many.
That's not so many. Okay. Well, I'm especially glad you're here, and it's a privilege to be your member of parliament.
Oh, we're just trying to secure your votes for next year.
You know what? I totally am. Totally am.
That's good.
And I'm not ashamed to ask for your votes. It's nice to meet you, Eric.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah,
good to see you
really,
again. You're
really
very
good to
kind.
see
We'll see you again soon. All right, so that's the minister's take. But obviously, lots of people have lots of interest in Trump, the media, the relationship with Canada, and we went to talk to some of them. Take a look at this.
Our syllabus is written every week by Donald Trump and the hurricane that surrounds him. I am Sam Tannenhouse. I'm a historian and journalist. I was the editor of the New York Times Sunday Book Review. Trump himself has decided, what does he call him now, Lovable Ted or something? Beautiful Ted. Right. My lecture course is called Trump and the Media. We sometimes call it Trump in Real Time. I have 180 students in a lecture hall. We look at how this particular presidency is kind of shaping our media landscape and how that media landscape is affecting politics. So is she trying to give them encouragement when she says that?
Yeah, she wouldn't go on like
We
Fox.
come in here every day and we have a conversation. I tell people I am not the professor, I'm the ringmaster. Jackson, yeah, go ahead.
I don't necessarily think we could actually really call Donald Trump anti-Semitic, because all of his support and forcing America to support Israel.
To say that because he supports Israel, he can't be anti-Semitic is as absurd as saying he can't be Islamophobic because he supports Saudi Arabia.
Yes, ma'am. You're going to say something, then we're going to go way back.
I think it's really dangerous when we use that kind of language.
The president confident about Republicans' chances on Tuesday.
I noticed in the first class I taught, whenever I asked the students why an issue seemed to be ratcheted up, immigration or the economy or health care coverage, someone would invariably raise a hand and say, the midterms.
If the election were held today, we would win.
If what she's saying is like going to happen doesn't happen, there are going to be so many of those like YouTube remixes of her going, we're gonna win. Like, it's so bad. I don't know why you would do that.
It has made them realize the media they're so at ease with are now the way global politics is conducted. We're talking about the intersection of Canadian and U.S. politics. As an older person who came up in a different climate and different era, to stand in front of a classroom with 180 young people, 140 of them very bright young women from all over the world, and hear them talk about what they saw is one of the most valuable experiences I had. It also made me realize that's why we're doing this course.
Okay, welcome back to the national conversation. This is the fun part. This is where you get to converse with us. And so for everybody who is watching on Facebook.com/thenational, stick your questions there in the bottom. If you're watching on YouTube, do the same. If you are on Twitter, our Twitter pages, the hashtag is the national conversation. We want all your questions on social. And I know that the audience is very smart because you had very smart questions for Chrystia Freeland. So thank you for that. So if you have smart questions, put up your hands and we will get them to this super great panel here. I'm gonna start with a social question, an online question first. Adrienne is the first victim. Phil Vogler on Facebook asks, what do you think it will take before the media can shake this fake news label, or has it changed forever? Adrienne.
I think that's a really good question. It's been around for a long time. Donald Trump did not invent this, did not come specifically out of this election. It's been around since the 1890s.
Well, tell your story you told me.
Which one?
She told me a story in the change room earlier while we were getting ready.
Oh, Zimbabwe? Okay,
yeah,
okay. So it's 2008. We're in Zimbabwe covering the election, and Robert Mugabe is rigging it spectacularly. We go to a polling station and there's a field, and it's just a field, and every 10 feet or so there's a placard with a number like H174 or C298. I thought, well, what is this? And then we realized there were buses bringing people in to vote. And so we went up to them, and they all had cards corresponding with the tiny patch of land. So and they all said, oh yes, we were given money to come here and given a card, and so then we vote because that patch of land is ours. So we saw a ZANU-PF official, and Thunderboots here marches up to him, and
she's Thunderboots.
Yeah, sorry. and says, you've got to be kidding. Nobody lives here. This is a field. This is outright voter fraud. And he said, I don't see what you're seeing. This isn't true. You're the problem. This isn't the problem. Which we found was incredulous. We spent some quality time in the Harare Central Jail, just a tiny little bit of time for that. But that was the first time I'd ever been confronted with someone who was saying the sky is not blue, it is orange. You're the faker. Are we destined to keep this label? To a large degree, that's on us. I think this is a time when we have to work harder to be more transparent. We have to keep pushing to be right, to acknowledge when we're wrong, to push the schools to teach civics and media literacy. What is happening in the United States does not have to happen here. There's something called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which looks at how people trust in sort of NGOs and the media. It's different for Canada and the United States. The trust in the media has gone up in Canada as it's gone down in the United States. So that's important, but we can't be complacent. And I think to a large degree, this really is on us, where we are, to be, And can I just say, now I'm on a tear here. Interesting listening to the minister. It was a phenomenal interview. I was curious about what she was saying about the support for the media. I think we all appreciate that, but again, we can't be complacent. This country has terrible access to information laws. Our whistleblower protection is weak at best. We sometimes slip down the press freedom index. And if the current government really believes in protecting democracy and journalists, here's your opportunity. Fix that.
Okay, Karen has a question next. Yeah, you can applaud for Adrienne. Yeah. Lisa Cole on Facebook asks, can Democrats change the gun problem in the United States?
Oh,
yeah, I knew you were going to go a deep sigh there.
No, that's a really good one.
Hard.
It is really hard. I mean, look, this is going to be one of those issues that's going to go back to that question you were talking about before, about where is the party? Is the party going to play to its base, which definitely is anti-gun, pro-gun control, very heavily urban. Having guns in urban areas is a demonstrated problem, which is why some cities have gone so far as trying to institute rules on their own. But federally, the Second Amendment, popular thing in districts which Trump has won, which are represented by Democrats now. There is momentum in the Democratic Party to institute some gun laws. And when I say some gun laws, I'm talking about universal background checks. I'm not actually even talking about reinstituting the assault weapons ban, because that's kind of like the next level goal for a lot of the Democrats.
We're
talking about screening level. We're talking about there being people who are in terrorist watch lists not being able to access firearms. But to be able to do that, you have to close the gun show loophole, basically, that lets people be able to purchase certain firearms without having to go through those federal background checks. That's step one. You might see enough momentum for that in the Democratic Party, generally speaking, right now, but they don't have the Senate. And if they don't have the Senate, it's going to be one of those issues that if you've got some Democrats in the House, the new Democrats especially, who are in these wavering districts where it's not necessarily that popular with the locals, I don't know if they blow their capital on that. As much as parts of the country may want it to happen, as much as we may see these shootings, the mass shootings happening every other week, and it's horrifying, and it's not just schools, it's synagogues, it's shopping malls, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. But in a way, I think we're getting dulled to the shock and the horror of it. And another way, I think the Democrats are going to be picking their battles, and when you only have one house of the Congress, you can't win this one full out. You just have to campaign on it, and you might not win the campaigning.
Okay. We have a question in the audience. Nicole, if you just want to state your name and your question, if you want to direct it to someone, otherwise I can do that. Off you go.
Just a general question. My name's Nicole. I was just wondering if you could help me understand how somebody who made his millions from his rich father has become the champion of the elite. I just don't understand how he is the person standing up for the common person when he is anything but.
The champion for the middle class.
Against the elite.
Yeah. Okay. Aaron, you want to tackle that, and then I'll make Keith do it as well.
It is one of the most remarkable kind of reinventions that we've seen, politically speaking, in American politics. It is a guy who built his not just built his fortune through these means, but he really built his public reputation about being the rich guy. He was the guy on The Apprentice. He was doing media interviews back in the 1970s and 1980s talking about how rich and wealthy and fabulous his life was. And then he has kind of shepherded this political movement, which is all about kind of working class voters. We have actually seen American politics shift more towards college-educated voters being more Democratic and high school-educated voters going more Republican right now. I think if you look at his style, it has always had an appeal to those people, even as he has been the I'm rich guy, even as he's been the gold-plated, I have my own airplane guy. He's always spoken to those people. Those were the people who were watching The Apprentice when it became so popular. So this was always kind of a built-in constituency for him. He's in a lot of ways selling them an image of what they think is a rich person. Like he is kind of the caricature of a rich person and what they aspire to. And that's got a lot of appeal to people. So he can do that and also not necessarily be the guy who seems really highfalutin and mixing with polite society all the time.
Yeah, it's the difference between being rich and establishment. Is that part of the establishment? Is that what he's managed to convince people of?
He's always been kind of shunned by that class of society, even as he is super wealthy. He's a guy in New York City who's never been a part of that set, and a lot of people think kind of harbors resentment towards the other rich people in New York City.
He had a gold toilet, but that didn't mean he was part of the elite.
Yeah.
Take a stab, not at the toilet part, the rest.
Well, I think you can never, I think, overestimate the personal drive among all of us, I think, to some extent, to believe what we want to believe. And Donald Trump, over his life, his adult life, has concocted an image of himself that to some people looks obviously like a con man, but to others looks like a heroic story of someone who, started off with maybe not very much, only $1 million or so, built a fortune, lost it, and then fought his way back. It's a very attractive story. It's not true. But as I said, if you want to believe it, he certainly has all of the little ingredients there. I mean, one of the most fascinating things about the New York Times big scoop on his tax dodges and the way he and his family worked to avoid paying taxes through secession was just how early Donald Trump understood the power of having the trappings of wealth. Even though he didn't have them, they were all supplied by his father. He knew that having the big car and having the penthouse and having the glamour symbols was a hugely powerful communications device. And when you look at it, I'm not really someone very familiar with The Apprentice, but I've seen the opening of The Apprentice, and it just bing, bing, bing hits all of these superficial.
That's what it says. That's the
aspects
theme
of it.
song. Yeah.
Yeah, and I, there is this thing where Donald Trump is, among other things, he's a poor person's idea of a rich person. A not very bright person's idea of a smart person. It goes on and it's condescending and all of that stuff. But again, right back to where I started, people believe what they want to believe. And that's almost a universal principle that applies to everyone, I think. And he exploits it very well.
Yeah.
He understands that very, very well.
And I think, Nicole, not that I'm Keith Boag, but I think he said a lot of things that they wanted to hear, and they didn't feel anybody else was saying them. We have a question in the audience here. You see your name, and if you want to direct the question, go ahead.
I'm Abby.
Hi, Abby.
And it is a general question that how can Canada avoid the divisions we see forming in the U.S., and what can we learn from them?
All right, well, we'll start with the Canadians, because that would be mean to make you guys figure out our whole country in a day.
We're still working on ours.
Part of a day.
Keith, do you want to start? Because Keith also was the chief political correspondent in Ottawa when I started there, so you've done both sides at very dramatic moments.
Yeah, I mean, there's something going on in the United States right now that doesn't get nearly the attention that it deserves at the same time that everybody is aware of it. And that is going on with right-wing media. There's a tendency to try to both sides this issue and say, yeah, on Fox News, they say these things, but you've got MSNBC. That's not what's happening. There's a very good book about this called Network Propaganda that just came out last month that has done a deep dive into data to look at what is really happening here. What is really happening here is that at the center of the political spectrum and towards the left, you have establishment mainstream media such as the New York Times, BBC, PBS, and NPR. I think those are the four that they name. And the equivalent on the other side goes right over the center-right media, which hardly exists anymore. Right-wing moderate media hardly exists in the United States anymore. The equivalent of those established media that I just listed on the right is Fox News, Sean Hannity, which is distinguished from Fox News, Breitbart, and the Daily Caller. None of these organizations has any of the trust indicators that we must learn to look for when we're looking at the media that we're going to trust. We just need to get used to that now. We cannot take things for granted. There's too much media out there. But this problem that I'm identifying in the United States does not exist, or at least not to that extent in Canada right now. And that, I think, is an important protection, and that's a self-serving argument, I realize. But here at CBC, we have an ombudsman. Here at CBC, we talk about the way we do our journalism. Here at CBC, if we make a mistake, we say we made a mistake. We try to explain how it happened and how we will avoid making that mistake again. You will not see that on most of the right-wing media that now has influence in the United States. And just one final point on this, whatever happened to those voices, like George Will is not dead. He was the voice of conservatism for a while. You don't hear him anymore unless you listen to MSNBC. He's left the Republican Party. He's also left right-wing media and moderate conservative media, and he's all the way over there because that's the only place he can talk, and he's not the only one. Max Boot is another example. There's another one who just doesn't come to mind right now, but I've said enough. I think you get my drift on this.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go to a question on social. And I will just weigh in because I'm the moderator. I get to do that when I want. That maybe having more than two parties leads to less polarization.
Could you say just
Yes.
maybe one or two things about the Trust Project as well, because we're involved in that, and I think you are too, right? The Trust Project is something new that's trying to train people how to understand their media.
Yeah.
what transparency really is, what accountability really is, and how to look for trust indicators in the media that you're looking for.
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing. CBC is part of it. It's new, but I think it's necessary because there are challenges to media now that are not stuff that we're very familiar with dealing with. It's new to us as well.
I'll let Adrienne weigh in before I go to social, because this is an area that I know is you think about a lot.
I do, yeah, and I find that there's an interesting intersection between a rise, like don't laugh, a rise in measles and a rise in people who believe in sort of fake news or polarization. And the RAND Corporation did a really good study. It's called Truth Decay. Excellent name, I have to say. And, you know, one of the things that leads to sort of fake news taking hold is an absence of trust in normally respected institutions like science, doctors. When that starts to happen, the forces that pull that along towards like an anti-vaxxer movement use the same mechanisms as the forces that pull along for the alt-right movement sometimes. So if you look in Europe, places where the anti-vaxxer movement has taken hold, Italy in particular, you know, the rise in measles is like 4 times what it was now than a few years ago. That correlates with places where there's a rise in the accusations of fake media, fake news. So I think we have to pay attention to how science has dealt with that. And doctors say, all right, when we're confronted with this, you don't belittle people for their beliefs and dismiss their fears. You listen to them. You address what their concerns are. You calmly, humbly, with humility, try to walk through what the solutions are. And I think those are lessons that we need to learn here again, you know.
Why don't you both weigh in on that? Because we're sort of at the stage where we're wondering, how do we not let this happen? And you're right in it. So what do you do when you're right in it?
Well, I think Adrienne's point was well taken. It is not just a matter of trust in the media declining, and it's not just a matter of the president attacking the media. The president has spent a large portion of the last 2 years, whether you think this is warranted or not, undermining trust in many institutions. Very early on, it was the judiciary, where he suggests that there's really no such thing as an independent judge. He has spent the better part of 2 years attacking his own Justice Department, which is charged with neutrally upholding the law and holding lawbreakers accountable.
The FBI?
The FBI, yep. I mean, the kind of one of the central themes of his presidency is that there is no institution that you can completely trust. I am the person you can completely trust. And so we have seen the Republican Party especially turn against a lot of these institutions in ways that we hadn't seen before. The Republican Party used to be very pro-law enforcement. They used to be the law and order party. Now they don't trust the Justice Department to carry out the law. This has been kind of weaponized in a way that I think the results of it are going to be long-lasting, and it's going to be a situation in which people who have been trained to not take anything for granted and not to completely trust anything, to question everything. And when you start questioning everything, you can usually find something within that entity, whether it's a minor scandal, whether it's somebody you don't like, that is going to give you reason to continue to not trust them.
Do you want to weigh in on that? I have another question for you too, though.
Sure, really quickly.
Yeah.
I will just add that we're talking a lot about institutions and media and representatives. Those are all things that are at arm's length. And yeah, you can try to re-educate or say we're going to fund certain types of, commercials on certain networks and not on others. But fundamentally, people tend to believe what they can see with their own eyes and touch with their own hands. The president has been very, very good about bridging the very vast divide of the airwaves to make his supporters feel like, you're my guy, right? But and this kind of goes towards the urban-rural divide. This goes to people kind of playing it safe and sticking with their own. Everybody likes to complain about things. Nobody actually wants to get in their car and move to a swing state where maybe people don't look like them. We've had a decimation of the local newspapers in the middle of the country. There is no direct connection anymore between people and their local media outlet that they may not actually think is fake news. And just in any sector of society, like you can kind of the only way to kind of undo what is the narrative is by changing people's immediate reality.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the recipe for that is, but that's the only thing that can combat bigotry and racism and thinking that lies are truth or anything like that. And it has to be done on that very person-to-person level. to
And
actually
again,
change
harder in Canada where there is just fewer things, fewer media organizations. It's harder to get polarized in your little corner because we just don't have as many. Okay, here's a question for social. You have to be faster, I'm told, my producer says, because there's a lot of questions and you're talking too much. Okay. Now I'm in trouble. Karen, BR Crowbot on Twitter asks, is it time for the Democrats to stop trying to win within the rules when it seems like they are just out on the field playing by themselves and the Republicans are off playing a completely different game? That's a great question.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, there are definitely a bunch of Democrats that want to do that. I mean, to rip up the rule book and just become fighters.
I interviewed Mike Levinati. He's like, I just want to crush him.
Yeah, I mean, there are people that say like, hey, let's just try to beat the president in his own game. I would say that the Democrats do not have as charismatic a leader right now as President Trump. So if they try, they're just going to kind of die one by one until they find whoever it is that pulls the magic, I mean, not actually, but you know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
They don't have an Obama right now. They don't have somebody who's just like the person for the time, right? Yeah. And Trump is, in a way, right? As much as he's loathed, he's also loved for that reason. I think that this is, it depends on who you talk to, right? You've got Michelle Obama out there still kind of trying to parlay her whole when they go low, we go high type message. It's not really sticking for this time anymore, right? Because people are mad. Everybody is mad. Everybody is fired up, and they just don't have a way to channel it in the Democratic Party as well as they do in the GOP towards President Trump. So I guess that's sound logic if you find a person. And if you don't find a person, you got to find a way of speaking to more people than the president speaks to right now. And for that, you got to have a more
Okay, you can go quickly, otherwise I'm going to get
really
beat
quick,
down
I
here.
promise. The Republican Party is much better at being ruthless. They are much better at playing within the established rules and exploiting them. But Democrats can't take that approach as easily, and there is one very good reason. The median House district in the House of Representatives went for President Trump by 3 points. President Trump won 30 of the 50 states. The maps are favor towards Republicans. Republicans can be extreme and go to the, do these things. Democrats don't have the same kind of luxuries.
Which is one of the things that constantly blows my mind about the United States, that you allow that to happen. Okay, the audience has a question, your name and your question.
Hi, I'm Julianne.
Hi, Julianne.
And my question really is more relating to journalism and the news and what you guys are doing, and you do it really well. We are now looking on the TV every night, and we have domination of what's going on in the United States. We have some backup news coverage of what's going on in Canada, and a lot of what's going on in the rest of the world seems to just not be there as much as it used to be. And Adrienne talked about polarization and how you guard against it. And I think we have a tradition in Canada, specifically with the CBC, of having that outside view of an international perspective, which we're not getting as much as we may have used to even 4 or 5 years ago. So I'm just kind of interested in your own experiences and your thoughts about, do you miss not having as much of an opportunity to cover what else is going on in the world, or what are your ideas there?
Okay, well, Adrienne's our international world correspondent. So Adrienne can take this one, then we'll go to the next question.
Well, I would say firstly, reporters always want to be on every story. So it is a cage fight every time something happens. We all want to be there. And it's not ideal. Would I like to have more foreign bureaus? For sure.
It's our boss over there.
For sure, 100%. I'd also like to see more bureaus in Canada's north. So yes, absolutely. There are some fiscal realities here. It's tough. We do interesting things. We decided at the National that the movement of people is really important, is really something we need to spend some time looking at. So we went to Colombia to look at what is happening out of Venezuela. More people are moving out of Venezuela, if it stays on track, as left Syria. This is huge. This is a really important story for us. We led with it 2 nights in a row. It resonated with people, and yet there are some media critics who are like, ugh, CBC, what are you doing? So, sometimes you can't win for losing. Are we spending too much time on the American story? It's interesting. Sometimes people say that, and then on the night of the midterms, CNN in Canada had well over 1 million viewers. Now that's interesting for CNN in Canada. So when Canadians tell you they're not interested, I'm afraid they're not telling the truth. The question is, are they getting the right perspective on what's happening in the United States? We can't just say, it's just a tire fire, we're gonna look away. We have to look at it intelligently. Are we doing a good enough job of that? Sometimes yes, and maybe sometimes no. So I don't really know how to answer your question other than there isn't a reporter in this building who doesn't want to run out into the field every single day, I would say.
Yeah, I think a lot of the international coverage is maybe not where you would traditionally find it too.
Right.
Because, the reality is fewer people are looking at me on TV, more people are reading things online. So you'll see probably more international coverage online at CBC than you maybe would have seen on our flagship broadcast. But this show, which launched, this new version of the show, which launched 1 year ago on Monday, we're still alive, launched with a series of stories that Adrienne did in Syria. That's pretty risky, right? To say we're gonna not only send Adrienne to a dangerous place, but we're just gonna lead with that no matter what. So I agree that sometimes it's hard to not watch the traffic accident down there, but I think we do a pretty good job of trying to keep a lens on the rest of the world. I don't ever want to fight, though, to go and cover a hurricane. I don't like hurricanes. You can have all the hurricanes.
Okay, good.
Okay, Ariel's got a question here with this gentleman. Hello.
Hi, my name is Jeevan. I just want to talk about or ask about how does the media cover Trump going forward? We've seen Trump during the campaign and his more outlandish views being given a platform by Fox, by Breitbart, et cetera, et cetera. But I've lived in England for a while and I see how they treat politicians and how they cover them. And in terms of going forward with the fake news and the proliferation of that, and in terms of Trump's more outlandish views, how does the US media and the mainstream, the CNNs, the NBCs, the ABCs, how do they cover Trump moving forward?
Okay, Aaron, you do this question, because it is something I know CNN at one point during the midterms was struggling with. Do we just put every rally of his up on TV, live? We know that it gets good ratings. Do we just put it up and let people watch it, or do we stop doing that? And they did pull back from that. So what do you think it means going forward?
It's a constant situation where we're adjusting, figuring out new ways, reevaluating ourselves. I think what you're seeing in the latter parts of the 2018 midterms is it's not just that they stopped airing these rallies live. They stopped airing them, and then once they were over, they instantly did a bunch of fact checks about exactly what was said in the rally and why it was wrong. We are seeing a change of course. I think, though, that there are some people that wish that if we ignored President Trump and they think he might just go away. They think that by putting the things he says out there, even if we're fact-checking them in real time, somehow this is doing him a favor. I disagree with that. I think that's too cynical to believe that the people can't understand what's true and false. If you're telling them what's true and false, we may need to increase media literacy to get people to actually understand what we're telling them, but there is no amount of fact-checking that I think is too much. If people don't care that the president is saying things that are false, that's on them, and you're probably not going to get through to them anyways.
Okay. Behzad Nouri on Facebook, Keith, this one's for you, asks, how can Canada get inoculated against the surging forces of populism? And can what happens in Ontario, I guess they mean with the Ford government, be an early symptom for Behzad?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer what's going on in Ontario because I wasn't
That's fine, but
here
do the
for it.
inoculation part. Can we, because you've thought a lot about populism. Is it something that will come here, is here, that we can fight against? Or is it bad at all?
Well, there was a debate here on Friday a week ago between Steve Bannon and David Frum that looked at this question, whether populism is an irresistible international or global force And Bannon's view was, yes, it is, and the only difference is whether the populist is going to be right-wing kind of Donald Trump or a left-wing kind of Bernie Sanders. And I didn't find that persuasive. I think that, you know, what Donald Trump has done that he probably didn't intend to do is make people more aware that they can't take anything for granted now. And we have the good fortune to be able to learn this from a distance. Our friends in America do not. They have to live through it. And that is one of the reasons that I would have said also if I had been answering the woman's question there. What's happening in the United States is not a small story. It is a huge story. And I know you know that. I don't intend in any way to sound condescending about that. But alarm bells should be going off all over the place about this. When I talked earlier about, you know, how difficult it is for us to figure out ways to cover them because some of the traditional methods that we've relied on to cover things of legitimate controversy may not work for us now because the president is sometimes behaving in a deviant way. I meant the kind of things that Aaron was talking about when the president launches attacks against his own Justice Department and tries to discredit them and tries to help erode the trust of the people of the country in their own Justice Department. The same could be said for the media. The same could be said for any enemy of the president. There's nothing that he will not toss aside, rip to shreds, grind down if that happens to be in his personal interest. And I think we have to be hardened against this and speak truthfully and with the principles of objectivity and some detachment and accuracy as always. But we can't be blind to what's actually happening here because it's not normal.
Karen, I want you to weigh in on that too, on the issue of can you be inoculated against populism?
I'm going to say no. And I think that's not because it depends on what the populism's for, really. I mean, you know, populism is not inherently an all bad thing.
That's right.
It depends on what the message of that is behind it. Sometimes institutions are wrong. Sometimes institutions need to be risen up against. That's been how things have changed over history, right? But I guess when populism only speaks to a very tiny subset of the population that is opposed to other parts of the population also, you know, having a say in the national conversation, that's when it gets really ugly and messy. And I don't agree with Bannon either that everybody is predestined towards that sort of implosion, I suppose, that can happen if you fuel this sort of thing. But it needs to be controlled, and that gets back to what we were talking about a few questions ago of, you know, how do you push back against all these generalizations that are made that make people start to just think in whatever way they're going to think in and not kind of live in the greater reality of their district or state or province or country or whatever that is. And I still think that's, you know, populism works better if there's a lot of person-to-person stuff that's defining the populism, not just some person at the top that's telling everybody what to think.
Okay, we're going to take a couple more questions, then we're going to wrap it up. This gentleman gets one of them. What's your name and your question, sir?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for holding this event. My name is Rahul. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity because my question is something we're seeing consensus grow on and be talked about more, and that is around climate change. I'm really struggling to see it focused on and truly be given prioritization. CBC is trying, but I really want to hear your thoughts on what's it going to take for it to be a genuine priority at the beginning, middle, and end of conversations like this, particularly in the context of Canada-US relations. Thanks.
Karen wants in already, I can tell. I have some thoughts too, but you go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is also just going to be a question of both individual people and corporate entities that hold a lot of sway and that give a lot of political contributions, prioritizing this issue also, because it's just so fundamentally messy also. You don't have, in the United States at least, you don't have a president that's inclined to take any proactive steps. You don't have a party that's inclined to take any proactive steps towards doing something about climate change because the GOP traditionally represents areas that it would cost them a lot of money to do that. Like, I mean, this is about bottom lines a lot of the time, you know, both for people that are the consumers and for the people that are the job creators of what they do. So that has to change, and once you start talking about changing that from the federal level with taxations, those become dirty words and we end up doing nothing. I don't think the United States is going to be a leader on this in the next few years. There's no chance. We pulled out of Paris. We don't have any political drive to do it, and because we're divided, there's nothing to get done. But Aaron might feel differently.
And no, when Democrats tried to do something about it,
They haven't
when they
passed
had control of Congress and the presidency, they tried to pass a cap and trade bill. Many of the House members who voted for it, the Democrats, wound up getting knocked off in the next election. And that's a cautionary tale for anybody who would take this up going forward.
I was just going to say, I think part of what's happening too is that it's still, for a lot of people in North America, is something that's happening somewhere else. So until you have climate refugees banging on the shores here, it's going to be something, in your mind that's somewhere else, and we're hearing so many stories about clever adaptations. There's a type of rice that's being grown in Mali that they've learned how to find a way to make so much rice grow in a place with so little water. And so instead of saying, why is there so little water and how can we fix that, there are all sorts of celebrations about the fact that this rice can grow in this sort of circumstance. So I think a lot of money and attention is being pushed towards learning how to adapt, how to game nature, as opposed to trying to deal with climate change. And so I think it's still a bit of an academic conversation for most people in North America.
I would say wait till the next federal election, because it's going to be, I think, a fundamental issue for this country. We have one party that just today, the Liberal government, imposed a carbon tax on Ontario because they pulled out of the cap and trade. They said this is going to be the way forward, right? We have yet to hear what the Conservatives' plan is. So if you aren't hearing enough of climate change or how we deal with it, you're about to get sick of it, I think. I promise you that.
Don't write in, really.
It's going to be a big one. I'm not supposed to take one more. I'm taking one more. I'm going to defy everyone. So Ariel, you had one person left, I think, right? I'm going to get Ariel. No. Anyone else? Last one. Going once? Yeah. Okay. You. We don't even have a microphone. Go for it. I'm just going to go crazy. Oh, Nicole's right there.
Hi, my name's Angela. This is a question for the people from
Washington.
Aaron
and Karen. Yeah.
How likely do you think it is that Trump is going to pull a move and try to change the Constitution to end presidential term elections, presidential term limits?
Look, it's
great one. What a good last question.
Okay, and I hate to get real textbook about this, but I think that if he may tweet about it. Who knows? We can't control what he does on his personal account, but not at all likely. That the chances of that happening are zero, and it's because in order to pass a constitutional amendment, basically, to be able to change that sort of thing, you either need to get what's the percent of the
Two-thirds majorities in Congress?
It's more than that, isn't it?
And three-fourths.
Three-fourths of the states. Two-thirds majorities in both houses and three-fourths of the states. You have, even though the House won more Democrats than it has in decades in terms of flipping the election, you don't have that right now with Democrats. And even if you did, it wouldn't play so well necessarily in trying to get that done. And then constitutional amendments take time. They take time because they have to go to the state legislatures. Yes, there are a lot of state legislatures under GOP control, but it is by no means a wash, and you just don't have the numbers for it. So why play that game unless you want to distract people from everything else, and then you might see a tweet about it. Who knows?
Okay, again, I'm not supposed to do this. I'm supposed to wrap up. You can each have 30 seconds to tell me what you think 2020, the presidential, is going to hold. We don't have a Democratic nominee yet, but what do you think 2020 will bring? Keith, you go first.
What do you mean?
Well,
you mean will he win?
No. Will he win? Will America be more polarized? Is it, are they going to change the color of the sky? I don't know. What do
I
you?
can say anything I want.
Anything you want.
Well, let me
Looking forward.
Let me repeat a question
But be
that I was
quick.
asked
Yes.
when I spoke to another group at lunchtime today. One of the questions I would ask, and I'd actually like to hear you guys on this, I was asked what I thought the likelihood would be that if Trump loses in 2020, he doesn't accept the loss, characterizes the election as fixed, and creates a crisis by refusing to step down. What is the likelihood of that?
That's like a science fiction novel, or is it? Aaron, then Karen.
What would be the question from there is what would be the enforcement mechanism? We would have the courts basically trying to take him out of the White House, and we would, his supporters at that point would have to rise up and say, this is not fair. I'm cynical about American politics. I'm not that cynical about American politics. I think he'd put up a stink and say this was rigged, but then eventually he'd go away and say, I never actually lost, but I'm just going to go.
Karen.
I was just going to say, these are the things that it's fun to sit back and kind of just intellectually fantasize about, right? Like, who has control over the U.S. Marshals versus the, the military? Yeah. Would the, the military commanders say, forget it, I'm not passing down this order? Like, all that stuff. But generally speaking, I think 2020 is going to be a lot about, no matter who's at the top of the Democratic ticket, it's going to be a lot about reliving a lot of the issues that were thrown on the table in 2016 and seeing if those can be resolved. I think you are going to have identity politics be a huge thing. I think no matter who wins, there's going to be accusations of voter fraud or voter suppression, and those are two things that we're talking about right now, especially on the suppression side. That's a real issue in the states. And I think you're going to hear a lot of discussion about just, how people feel in their gut about the president. The next 2 years are going to be defined by Democrats investigating the president wherever they can, stopping short of impeachment because that would be too risky for the swing district Democrats. And it's going to be are you rallying around not rallying around the flag, rallying around the guy. It's like rally around Trump, or are you going to say, well, we need to end this presidency with somebody else because the majority of the Democratic Party doesn't ever think he should have won that election in the first place.
Are you going to answer your own question, or are you just going to put that crazy idea out there?
My answer to the question was not to dismiss it, and maybe to add to it in a little bit, based on my own experience in 2016 at a Mike Pence rally. It was not a huge rally because it was Mike Pence, but they were all Pence-Trump supporters. And, just in chatting with one in particular, I will never forget that, he was a nice guy. We chatted about a range of things. But he wanted me to know, this was before the election, of course, he wanted me to know that if Trump lost, everyone in this room has a gun, I took that somewhat seriously, and it's scary.
Adrienne,
well,
like brighter note maybe, so I can close the whole thing up?
I don't think so. I was just going to say, I think unless the Democrats can figure out what they are for as opposed to who they are against, they're going to spend the next 2 years trying to determine their identity, and you're looking at a 2-term presidency.
Okay. Keith?
I'm sorry. Look, everyone's
a lot of groans. I don't know.
What was that?
Keith, Adrienne, Aaron, Karen, thank you. Thank you all. But mostly thanks to all of you. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your questions. I hope you had a good time, and we'll do it again soon. Thank you all very much. Thank you. You can watch a little bit of this tomorrow on the National. I will be home watching it in bed because it's been a long week. And you can watch another version, an hour version of it on CBC News Network at 8 p.m. Eastern. If you have some questions, we'll be milling around. We do appreciate you coming out. It shows us how much you love us. We love you. Thanks for being part of the conversation.